Okay, I have something special today. I got a nice delivery here from Thomas Christoph. He's an amazing fellow, Thomas is. He's done a great job in reproducing some tough to find vintage Commodore accessories. And most impressive is CMD reproductions. Reproductions of CMD components are spot on. And he has great attention, exceptional attention to detail. So I'll leave a link to his site in the description. So thank you, Thomas, for getting me not just this, but the other little piece of this that I'll introduce in a second. So what do we have here? Okay, so let me show you what we've got here. And bear with me, I'm going to ramble a little bit because I really want to tell the story behind this. And hopefully I don't screw it up too much. But it's fascinating, actually. So the TurboMaster V3, version 3, that's Thomas Christoph's reverse engineered version. Thomas has such a great attention to detail, trying to preserve as much vintage, but at the same time kind of resto modding, fixing the things that were wrong with the original version or the deficiencies, to where he's always not just giving you a replica, but an improved replica. So you don't have a lot of the pitfalls that the original had. In this case, what this device does is it increases the speed of the Commodore 64 from 1 megahertz to 4. So basically, in the most simplest terms, it quadruples your speed. The interesting thing with this, so the history behind this is this was introduced by Steve Schnedler of Schnedler Systems in 1991, the original TurboMaster. And there's two versions of it initially, one with Jiffy DOS and one without Jiffy DOS. The interesting thing is that it didn't last very long because in the middle of 1992, he stopped all support for it. I don't know if he lost interest or it just got to be too much of a pain, but basically he stopped supporting it, in the middle of 92. So it lasted, a year maybe? The interesting thing, though, that I don't know if people know or not, but is that the TurboMaster by Schnedler, sorry for messing up his name, but by Schnedler, was actually a reverse engineered clone of a German product called TurboProcess. And that product is actually the predecessor to TurboMaster, and that was reverse engineered, so to speak, or cloned. The interesting about the TurboProcess is that original board shipped with the PAL chips that didn't have their security fuses blown. And oversimplifying it, blowing your security fuses prevents access to the code, so to speak. So because those security fuses weren't blown on the original circuit boards on the PAL chips, Schnedler was able to reverse engineer even the chips, even the code. So basically, it was rather easy to duplicate. But there's a couple of things that he did in addition to not just duplicating it. So one of them was kind of funny. The processor, basically, there's a 00 address. And that 00 address is the bit setting to turn the turbo process, the original, on and off. Well, also the TurboMaster. The problem is that the original turbo process cartridge had that 00 location set to 1. And what happens is there's a lot of software that writes to that location and changes it to 0. And so if you can imagine, this thing's running in accelerator mode, and your software all of a sudden sets that location to 0, and it shuts off your acceleration. It disables the accelerator. So that's no good. So one of the things that Schnedler did is he revised the code to basically write a 0 to the 0 location. And then that way, if the software that would zero out that location did that, it wouldn't shut off the acceleration. So that was a huge, basically, design flaw that he fixed from the first iteration to his iteration. And the other thing he did is added the aluminum case. And this is really close to what the original aluminum case looks like. I'm going to open this up and let's see what's in it. But there's 4 switches on it. The disable and enable the accelerator. ROM 1, ROM 2 is if you have GPDOS internal, or you use ROM 2 for external. And then you have manual and soft switching, and then you have 1 megahertz and 4 megahertz. The interesting and then you have a reset button. The interesting thing with this is that when you're loading up GEOS, you had to have this on 1 megahertz because the GEOS wouldn't boot in 4 megahertz. So that was an interesting thing for scenario. Initially, also, it was made for the Commodore 64, and then it will work with the 128, but it has to be in Commodore 64 mode. So now, after this kind of went to the wayside, so to speak, most everybody knows the Super CPU. And the Super CPU, the difference is basically outside of the size. It accelerates the Commodore to a little over 20 megahertz. So you can see that there's a huge difference between accelerating to 4, and 20. So this was the ultimate standard. And the Super CPU came for the 64 and for the 128. And with the 128, you needed a daughter board inside the computer. And again, thanks to Thomas, he re-engineered the daughter board that was usually lost because it's embedded inside the 128, and a lot of people would tear out the Super CPU, and that would find its way, somewhere, and the daughter board would still remain with the 128. That they kind of got separated, and that daughter board became a little bit of a rarity. But thanks to Thomas, I have a few of those, so I can have the 128 daughter board on different 128 systems, and that's a different story altogether. But the Super CPU came out several years later after this. Now, it's not just this piece. We'll also talk about what this is, and this is a TurboMaster, and this is the master adapter. And basically, it's 2 pieces that go together, and this goes onto the Commodore, and then this allows you to use either GeoSRAM, or an REU. The only difference is it depends on which one you're using. The placement of the switches, all the way to the left is REU, and all the way to the right would be GeoSRAM. And then if you're using the REU, basically you'd have the TurboMaster on the top and the REU on the bottom. But if you're using GeoSRAM, you'd have to use the TurboMaster on the bottom, the GeoSRAM on the top. So you had a little bit of organizing that you need to do and switching that you need to do in order to get them to run. But the TurboMaster, along with the master adapter, was a pretty nice dual system. And we will get to the GEOS and using this and comparing it to the Super CPU in another video, because there's a bunch of settings that need to take place for this to properly work with GEOS, especially if you're using an REU. So we will get to that. In the meantime, let's see what's in here. And I got to use Allen screws here. So let me go and grab the right tool to unscrew those things, and we'll be right back. Okay, so let's see what's in here. And although this was originally made for the 64, it's nice that you can use it with the 128, because most productivity software, and most of the business side of things, use the 128 instead of a 64. So, all right, so let's see what's inside. Thomas, I hope this doesn't void my warranty. Okay. That's beautiful. So you can see a few little things. There's the Jiffy DOS. So the TurboMaster, it uses a 65 CO2 processor. So the processor is what's capable of running at a speed of 4 megahertz. And then we have 64 kilobytes of fast SRAM. We have a custom 32 bit EEPROM, and Jiffy DOS, of course. So let me get a little bit closer to this. And there's a link to this on the description, along with some of the history that I'm giving you here in the description of this video, if you want to take a look at those. But it's just a beautiful board. I mean, I'm a raving fan, obviously, of Core i64, which is Thomas's shop, but really cool. And to give credit where credit is due, so how this all came about, in 2020, Jim Brain was looking to finish reverse engineering the TurboMaster. And there's a link to his GitHub page, his project for it, in the description as well. It's also pretty fascinating. So Thomas Christoph then stepped in, and he got involved with the project, and then ultimately it came to fruition, like with most of his stuff. And I also have a link in the description of a really nice flow of forum conversation between Jim Brain and Thomas as they were working on this. So this is it's pretty cool how the brains in the Commodore world kind of get together and collaborate to make stuff like this happen. So that's the TurboMaster. That's the main unit. Let's talk about the master adapter here, because this serves an important function, especially if you're going to use GEOS and you're using GEOS RAM or an REU. So I'm going to build a case for this. Thomas hadn't gotten the cases done yet when he sent me this, but I don't have an issue in designing the case for it for myself. So this unit is pretty interesting. Let me give you the history on this guy. So towards the latter part of 1991, the master adapter allowed you to use GeoRAM, and I keep calling it GEOS RAM, sorry, but GeoRAM or the REU. Steve Schnedler collaborated with Paul Basaki, who came up with the basic principle of this. So this wasn't exactly all Schnedler's idea. A good portion of this idea came actually from Paul Basaki, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. So you might know the name Basaki if you're deep into the Commodore history, but he wrote the GEOS gateway for creative micro designs for CMD. So, and he also wrote their super quick GEOS drivers for their hard drives as well. So he interfaced CMD with his coding. So the interesting thing is Schnedler was known to state that this whole project with this master adapter was a complete nightmare. He added that GEOS is a pretty demanding program, and so there are some 64s also where the TurboMaster wasn't going to work nicely with the 64, and I would tend to think that those are probably the earlier 64 versions. In fact, Thomas has a little descriptor with his TurboMaster that basically states that there's only 3 or 4 different boards and more modern boards that he's tested it on. So that gives you an idea as to the complexity. So in the most simplest terms, this adapter has 2 small circuit boards. The small one plugs into the cartridge port of the C64 and this guy here, and it uses what is this 74LS244 buffer IC. So what it does basically, it buffers the clocks to act as a gateway for the read-write going back to the 64. And then the small board plugs into the larger board with the 2 expansion block sockets that are stacked vertically to make it easy to slip the cartridges into. And the vertical board basically has a TTL logic IC and 2K x 8 static RAM chip. For the REU adapter configuration, the 256 bytes are mapped into memory, and then they're visible to the TurboMaster and the REU. So basically what happens, all the data being exchanged between the two, meaning the REU and the TurboMaster, is through this 256 bytes of memory, which acts basically like a dual port memory. So that was pretty ingenious, because using that configuration, the 2 cartridges can communicate through this static RAM. And then normally the accelerator sees this 256 byte RAM, but when the RU requests the DMA, the master adapter tells the TurboMaster to relinquish the bus, and then the RU has access. So there's a little bit of technicality in there. So, and then I already explained that the switches on the top allow you to configure it for GeoRAM or RU. Now, here's the other interesting thing. Since Geo's 2.0R software already had the necessary driver for GeoRAM, the master adapter was already good to go with GeoRAM because the drivers were already there. You just pop it into the top slot, put the TurboMaster on the bottom, and you're good to go. But Paul Basaki had the task of developing the Geos drivers for the RU if you want to use the RU with this, which is very popular. So he basically, it took him around 4 or 5 months after the master adapter, this guy, was introduced, for him to write the RU driver for it. And then he made it compatible with the Geos Gateway, which is also sold by Creative Micro Designs, CMD. So to use the RU, you would use the opposite configuration than the GeoRAM. That's why you have to kind of swap ports, depending whether you're using the RU or the GeoRAM. So, that was an interesting way of handling the opposite differences in the configuration for the two. So lastly, so I can stop my rambling and we can do a quick speed test. The total pricing for the TurboMaster was around $199, and that's back in 1991. So you can kind of figure out, how much in today's worth that might be. The master adapter was initially $49, and then it was increased to $59 after the initial batches shipped. Now, Schneider was also contemplating offering the master adapter in a kit form, but that never materialized because, like I said, support for all this pretty much went away after about a year. And the interesting thing in reading some of the history is that there was little profit margin for Schneider in this. But to his credit, he continued to pursue it, along with Paul Basaki. And despite it being a nightmare project, he decided to pursue it because he really wanted to have the support, for the TurboMaster. So, it just made sense because otherwise you'd only, have the accelerator. But with this, you're now adding the ability to have additional RAM through either the RU or GeoRAM. So, all right, so there's my rambling. That's the story. There's a lot of the story written already, and a lot of documentation that I've scoured in researching this. They're all in the description. So feel free to use the description. Software for all of this is also in the description as well if you wanted to take a look at any of that. I don't believe there's source code in there, of course, but the software for all this stuff is there. A lot of PDF files. So let's take a look and see. I use a 128 more than I use a Commodore 64. And this will work on 28 and 64 mode. So let's take a look at what we've got there and see how fast this actually accelerates. All right. Okay, so I'm testing this on a Commodore 64 because it's already set up to record. I thought it'd be better than just shooting a video monitor screen. The assembly number is 250407. And here are the switch settings that I have set on this. Let me get this a little bit straightened out. So I have the TurboMaster disabled, and then I have it on ROM 1 because this doesn't have an internal Jiffy DOS, so I'm using the TurboMaster Jiffy DOS when it's enabled. Using soft, if you put this on manual, you're not going to be able to see the devices, the drive, so it's on soft. And I have this on 4 megahertz, not that it really matters because I have this disabled, but when we enable it, it'll already be set to 4 megahertz. So let's see what we've got then here. Okay, so I'm going to turn the system on. And this is native. It's disabled. I already wrote a quick program. Okay, this will go through 500 iterations. Probably want to drop it down to 300. It's all right, it doesn't matter. So we're going to go ahead and run this. and I can jabber for, I don't know how many seconds this will take. It'll show you the elapsed time at the end. Again, this is running in regular 64 mode, so this is how fast this program would have run, if you're typically running it. All right, 22 and almost 22 and a half seconds. So now I'm going to enable this. Okay, so you see now we're in Jiffy DOS because we're using the TurboMaster internal Jiffy DOS. So now let's go ahead and load that program. By the way, since it reset, you're going to see obviously that the program disappears, right? Okay, there's the program. Let's run this, and you can see the impact, right? This screams. So basically, it ran in almost 7 seconds. So that's pretty amazing. What is that? Like 3 times more. So that's, if you can imagine 1991, this was a breakthrough, right? Especially if you're using GEOS and you're doing some productivity stuff, number crunching, graphics. This was a huge thing. And that's without GEOS here. This is just natively running. So basically, it works fabulously. It does what it's intended. And now add a GeoRAM or an REU to it and run GEOS. That'll be a separate video because, like I said, there's some configuration, there's some settings that need to be done. I haven't tested it under GEOS, so that's a future video. But I wanted to get this out so you can see the amazing work put together by both Jim Brain and excuse me, Thomas Christoph over at Core i64. These are a little expensive in terms of when are you going to use this? So I don't, that priority of how much money you spend on your hobby will definitely come into play. It's not the most inexpensive device, but I think it's just a fascinating device that Thomas threw out in our community here, and you mix that with the master adapter. That's pretty slick. So I think that'll wrap it up. I don't think I need to cover much of anything else. I definitely, invite you to go to Core i64. That's Thomas's site. It's in the description. There's a lot of stuff in the description that is pretty cool. And the next time, I got to get Commodore Rob out here and see if we can get GEOS running. That would be fun to compare this to the Super CPU. I think the results will be obvious. But I definitely also want to try a package on there called Wheels that was made specifically for running accelerators with GEOS. So stay tuned. And I hope you got something out of this. And like I always say, live for today. You only live once. Enjoy life. All right. Peace out.